I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is Color Between the Lines. In this edition of Color Between the Lines, we're talking with Professor Miriam Thaggart, author of a book entitled Riding Jane Crow, African American Women on the American Railroad. Professor Thaggart is an accomplished author who's also written Images of Black Modernism, Verbal and Visual Strategies of the Harlem Renaissance. She also hails from my undergraduate alma mater, SUNY Buffalo. There, she is an associate professor of English at the University of Buffalo. Welcome, Professor Thaggart, to the BIN.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk with you.
It's a pleasure here as well. You write about this in the book, in the beginning of the book, and you please just tell our listeners, what led you to find out about women who worked alongside the Black sleeping car porters? Because I had heard about the Black sleeping car porters before, but I didn't hear about any Black women.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I was doing some research at the Newberry Library in Chicago on the Pullman porters. And during my research, I came across the application of a woman who was applying to be a Pullman maid within the Pullman company. I was really surprised by locating this application because I had never heard of the Pullman company maid. I was just curious about why I very rarely heard about these women. I was curious about what their experiences were like within the company. And one question led to another, and I just started doing more research on Black women and the American train.
Wow. What did you find, I guess, when reading about these women's lives on the train? Was it very difficult being a Black maid?
I think there was some difficulty, and we know about the difficulties of the Black men who worked as porters. All of the slights, the difficult working conditions they had that led to the development of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And I think for the maids, it was even more complex. Well, the Pullman company maid would have been the only Black female employee within the Pullman compartment. So when we think about the various jobs available with the Pullman company that depended upon working with the white traveling public, that would have been the Pullman porter, of course, it would have been a conductor, would have been some of the engineers, and then, of course, the Pullman maid, who was there primarily to take care of the female passengers, children, and the elderly. And I think being the sole Black female employee within this space that is both public and private just led to a number of, tense situations. So, you would have maids who would be accused of theft, if an item went missing. You had maids being reprimanded if the woman's restroom wasn't kept clean. And then there was always these sort of subjective complaints, like maybe a maid looks sort of angry or insubordinate. So I think it was a job that had its advantages, just as being a porter had its advantages, but also, keeping in mind that there were certain tasks and the space of the Pullman compartment made it, I think, a very fraught occupation.
I just thought it was so interesting how you addressed this. And in the book, I thought it was also interesting how you address how on railroads there used to be, the ladies' space, but how Black women often didn't fit into that space if they were a passenger, or at least they had to struggle to fit in when it came to riding the railroad after the Civil War. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really important aspect of the book. So in the 19th century, there were these train cars called ladies' cars. And these were train compartments that were nicely upholstered. They were usually kept cleaner than other train cars. They were sometimes called ladies' cars or first-class cars. So if you were a white woman, a white middle class or upper class woman traveling by yourself or with a male companion, you could ride in these so-called ladies' cars or ladies' spaces. When African American women, middle class African American women, wanted to ride in these ladies' spaces, they would be forced off, sometimes very violently.
Mm.
And probably one of the most well-known women to be forced off of a ladies' car, a first-class car, was Ida B. Wells, who was forced off a car in Tennessee in the 1880s and sued. There were other Black women who sued when they were forced off of these ladies' cars. And in the book, I take a look at some of those lawsuits, arguing how important it was for middle class Black women to have access to this space titled a lady space, because so often in our history, Black women have been denied that particular term, lady, and all of the class and courtesies that are associated with that particular term.
Yeah, I was reading about that, and I thought that was quite interesting how her femininity wasn't celebrated, but also she was kind of over-sexualized in many cases.
Yeah, there was one case of a woman in Mississippi, Corinth, Mississippi. Her name was Jane Brown. And when she tried to ride in a first-class ladies' car, she was forced off because the conductor claimed that she was a prostitute. And I think one of the reasons for this assumption was because she was frequently seen about the train station depot. And I make an argument about the mobility of Black women, how Black women who are highly mobile might have their chastity questioned by others. And so it was a startling thing to read about how a Black woman who really she was making a living. She was selling food her mother cooked. She was selling it to train passengers who were there at the station waiting for another train.
Right.
And I just look at how, because Black women, if they're assumed to be very mobile, there's also an assumption about their sexuality and their sexualization. The sort of criminalization of Black female mobility is what I was looking at.
Wow. You address how Black Americans were in many ways kind of in a place of limbo during Reconstruction and the Reconstruction period and Jim Crow, because they were given freedom to travel in many sense for work, but restricted by racism and inequality. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that connection between the two and how it affected African Americans? Because I thought it was really interesting how you talked about being in the train, being in a space where you were solid in one space, but you were moving forward. And that kind of reflected what a lot of African Americans felt about their lives, that they were able to, in some ways, move forward, but not.
Yeah. So I think mobility is one of the classic signs of citizenship. I think Americans value our freedom of movement. And for people who were formerly enslaved, once emancipation happened, testing your freedom by moving away was one way to evaluate that sort of newfound freedom. And I think around the time of Reconstruction, when you have a number of African Americans coming into more economic, social, and political prominence, one way to tamper that sort of prominence and independence was to limit their movement.
Yeah.
So you have a number of segregation laws being enacted during the period of Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, laws that would limit African Americans being able to ride without any sort of harassment on the train, and later, of course, in the 20th century on buses. So I look at how African Americans were able to literally and metaphorically move more freely during this period of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. And at the same time, that's when we see these laws being enacted that would attempt to restrict or circumscribe their mobility. And then, of course, we have one of the most important Supreme Court cases takes place and is decided in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which gave legal sanction to this whole idea of separate but equal. And so I just think it's really curious how this idea of mobility is so tied into our sense of American citizenship. And it's a right and a privilege that has historically been limited for African Americans. And I think we see a little bit of version of that today in the 21st century when we think about this concept of driving while Black. Are the large number of cases in which African Americans, both men and women, are harmed through a very innocuous, which should be an innocuous traffic stop, ends up, with the death of a Black or brown person. So I think we see this significance of mobility even today.
Wow. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard speaking with Professor Miriam Thaggart, author of a book entitled Riding Jane Crow, African American Women on the American Railroad. I wanted to ask, during your research of Black women and their influence on the railroad, did you find one story that particularly maybe surprised you?
I was surprised to learn that there were Asian American women who worked for the Pullman Company, primarily on the Western train lines. That was something I didn't know about, just as I didn't know about the Pullman maid, the African American Pullman maid. I didn't know about Asian American women. And then I did some work on Polly Murray, who was a lawyer, a scholar, and a priest. And I have to admit, I didn't know that much about Murray before I began this book. And through research, found out what a very fascinating and important individual Murray was. And now there's a documentary on Murray's life. And I just think this was such an important, significant figure. And I was really surprised that I had never heard of Murray before conducting my research.
Often when I read historical research like this, I try to connect it to what does it have to do with me here and now. And you did touch on that just briefly in regard to driving while Black. What do you think, perhaps other than that this book offers to readers who may say, well, what does that have to do with me now?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think travel is so important. Recently, there was a African-American singer who was forced off of a airplane because there were claims that she was being very loud and abusive to other people. I start off the book with an incident that took place in 2015. This Black women's reading group, they wanted to meet on the Napa Valley wine train, and they were forced off because it was claimed that they were being violent and abusive. And of course, that turned out to be false. So I think all of those more recent incidents are tied into this idea of Black mobility, how Black people move through public or private space. And can you do so freely without worrying about, how you may look or being dressed a certain way? I think all of those questions about respectability and appearance, somehow they're also tied to this idea of how freely can you move about in any particular space without worrying about, how you're dressed or how your hair looks or what you're wearing that particular day.
And that could be criminalized or cause you harm because of those particular things. That's really great.
Exactly.
I'm wondering what lessons that you hope your readers come away with after reading your book.
I really hope people question those sort of large-scale narratives we have about our country. So say, for example, this whole idea of progress. I think the railroad, the train, is very much linked to the sense of U.S. ingenuity and progress. But when we think about that term, very rarely do we consider how Black women may have experienced that particular concept or a specific form of transportation like the railroad. So I'm hoping people will think more deeply about the sort of mythological narratives that we tell about the U.S., this idea of truth, justice, and the American way. How does that really look for specific groups of people may not be white or male? How do we center the perspectives and the experiences of Black or brown women who may have been overlooked in those narratives that we were taught in grade school or high school?
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks again for joining us on the BIN, and I really hope that you can join us again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Professor Miriam Thaggart, author of the book entitled Writing Jane Crow, African American Women on the American Railroad. That's it for this edition of Color Between the Lines. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.